Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Jamie Lynch from Build TE and Everyone Reads Pennsylvania. We are excited to co-host tonight's event featuring Tatiana Elisaf, and she is a Master of Arts and a CCSLP. The missions of both of our organizations are rooted in the idea that parents and educators should have access to evidence-aligned information regarding assessing, teaching, and supporting children. Tonight's presentation will fulfill one of the most common questions we get from people in both organizations. How do I figure out what the literacy needs of my student are? Build TE is a parent-led group that supports Tredyffrin-Easttown parents and caregivers of children with all types of learning differences through education, advocacy, and the sharing of resources. Everyone Reads PA is a nonprofit organization that supports families and educators in obtaining and providing literacy education rooted in the science of reading so that all children in Pennsylvania learn to read to the best of their potential with as little emotional impact as possible. I am really excited to introduce Tatiana to you. She is the owner of Smart Speech Therapy. She specializes in performing comprehensive language and literacy assessments with a focus on the implementation of evidence-based intervention for students with language, social communication, and literacy disorders, reading, spelling, and writing. She is a clinical instructor at the RWJ Medical School Department of Psychiatry and a clinical supervisor at Rutgers Day School. Welcome, Tatiana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I am so excited to see you guys here. And today we're going to be talking about my favorite topic. And actually, my favorite topic is not necessarily the differentiation between neuropsychological and comprehensive language and literacy assessments. My favorite topic is actually functionality. So what I aim to do today is to make this presentation as functional as possible and open the floor to your questions. So in other words, whenever we're doing any assessment, whether it's psychological, neuropsychological, occupational, speech-language therapy, language and literacy, etc., what we're looking for is to see not just what is happening with the child in terms of strengths and needs. We're looking to help that child. That means that we have to produce something functional as a result of that assessment, something that will help the child in a school setting, not just with accommodations and modifications, but with specific and targeted treatment goals, which will remediate whatever areas of difficulty or deficiency the child is experiencing. So allow me to share my screen so we can begin. So I would like to leave ample time for questions as well. So, all right. So the first thing I wanted to make sure is that everyone can see my screen well. If a few of you can just sort of indicate in a chat option that you can see it fine, no issues. We can proceed further. I just wanted to make sure that everything is moving smoothly. And it is visible and everybody can hear me all right, correct? No issues? Beautiful. All right, now I can expand my screen and as we're going along with this presentation, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A portion of this site, simply because it's going to be a little bit difficult. There's so many of you guys, and more are sort of, piling in. So it's easier if all the questions are in the Q&A that we are, so everything is there. All right. Let me expand my screen so we can go and talk about it. So today, the topic of today's conversation or this informational session is what are some basic differences between neuropsychological and language and literacy assessments. What I aim to do today is I want to review the basic differences between the purposes of each assessment. I want to discuss common neuropsychological language and literacy assessment batteries. I want to list components of each type of assessment. I want to describe importance of error analysis. I want to talk about the most important thing that any assessment can yield. And the most important thing that any assessment can yield is formulations of goals and objectives for targeted treatment, because this is really what we're looking for out of any assessment. We're not looking for anything else. We're looking for, okay, now that I know what the difficulties are, now that I know what the strengths are, what am I going to do about it? Because this is the most important thing that any assessment can provide to a parent or a school. All right, so now, of course, everybody wants to know where the slides are. Very, very simple. The slides are already available. The slides are available in the group called SLPs for evidence-based practice. They are posted there in the files section. So what I am going to do right now, you guys, I'm going to very briefly grab a link so you can have a direct link, and it's going to be posted in the chat option momentarily. You know what? Jamie is actually going to put it in the chat option herself, which is lovely. So we're just going to continue on. So Jamie, it's in the file section of the group. All right, let me dismiss all the questions regarding the slides, so I'm not bogged down by that. Okay, so let's talk facts. All right, we're going to start with neuropsychological testing. So typically, the point of a neuropsychological evaluation is to establish the connection between brain and behavior. So that's really what neuropsychologists aim to do. They're aiming to perform a battery of specific tests in order to figure out what is happening with the child's memory, what is happening with the child's processing speed, what is happening with the child's fluid reasoning abilities, and those are just examples of basic IQ testing functionality. Then, of course, they're looking to a number of assessments actually will add testing with respect to psychological functioning of the child, educational functioning of the child, and so on and so forth. So they're really looking to provide information regarding child's intellectual functioning, emotional functioning, psychiatric functioning, and executive functioning. And this is what typical assessments are looking to do. And of course, it's very important and valuable. One of the major reasons is you perform the assessment for differential diagnosis purposes. You want to either confirm or rule out learning disabilities. Testing is very, very extensive, takes multiple sessions, multiple hours. It assesses many areas, including memory, processing, visuospatial abilities, fluid reasoning, executive function, learning, and includes learning disabilities, giftedness, such as twice exceptional status, and more. Neuropsychologists typically do classroom observations. Many of the neuropsychologists I know can actually spend hours and hours in a classroom over multiple days, over multiple subjects. So not necessarily something for a space of an hour, but something for much, much longer. A number of neuropsychologists will add educational testing for further comprehensiveness. Typically, the title of such assessments will be Neuropsychoeducational assessments versus purely neuropsychological assessments. Okay. Now, to continue. All right. This is an example of some typical neuroeducational batteries. They are arranged here essentially in alphabetical order. No preference is given to each one. So does each neuropsychologist provide all of these tests? No, they do not. Here's what I did. I basically had a number of neuropsychological assessments compiled by me in the process of my own job, because I collaborate with a number of neuropsychologists. So I do consultations and I do my own assessments as well. So what I did was I went through all of the neuropsychological reports that I had, and I pulled whichever test was used by a neuropsychologist. And I pretty much compiled it for you for the purposes of just, basic education. So in other words, a neuropsychologist can use a number of these, but it really depends on what each neuropsychologist is comfortable with, what is in their repertoire, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned they're listed in chronological order. I also highlighted some of tests in green. The tests in green are tests I've noticed used by some neuropsychologists, and they overlap with speech-language pathologists. So the tests in green have been used by both neuropsychologists and speech-language pathologists. In general, the tests listed in just ordinary fonts, I have not seen being used by other speech-language pathologists so far. That doesn't mean that there is no one who is, there is no speech-language pathologists who do not use them. It's just simply I haven't seen it done. So these are an example just of those tests. Okay, so what happens next? Well, the neuropsychologist will spend many, many hours with the child. They will spend many hours with the child, observing the child, assessing the child, and so on and so forth. They will generate a lengthy report. The length of the report really depends on the neuropsychologist in question. Some reports are 19 pages, other reports are 40 pages. The sky is the limit. What is going to be included in that report? Well, they are going to include information regarding the child's full-scale IQ. If a child has any specific diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, positional defiant disorder, and so on and so forth, they will be included there. They might also include certain codes which are pertinent to learning disability in the areas of reading, in the areas of writing, in the areas of oral language, for example, in the area of mathematics, and so on and so forth. They will compile a profile of the child's learning strengths and needs. They will make recommendations for in-school accommodations and modifications. We'll talk about those on the next slide. We will talk about both recommendations made by neuropsychologists as well as, speech-language pathologists who perform these type of assessments. They will make some recommendations regarding special education placements. They will make referrals to relevant professionals, so they can make referrals to SLPs, occupational therapists, audiologists, for additional in-depth testing, and many of them will make recommendations for particular programs and services. And that part is highlighted because that part is very, very important. And whenever we're talking about any form of recommendations, we are going back to the topic of functionality. We want to make sure everything is functional. We want to make sure that everything makes sense. And that is why what I did for you guys was I pulled a number, I randomly pulled it, just whatever was in the pile of my neuropsychological reports, I randomly pulled to discuss some recommendations. Okay. These are included in your slides and handouts. So before I jump into this, I'm wondering if there is any professionals who would be willing to make comments regarding some of these recommendations and what might be some limitations. You can share the information in the chat option or in the Q&A. I'm not going to spend too long waiting, so if people have some thoughts, I would love that. I tried to highlight some of these for a very specific purpose. I really want to talk about whether something is functional or whether something is not necessarily that useful. Okay, I see that I have some comments. Why balance literacy? Why indeed? That is an excellent question. I don't know. Okay, let's go through a few of them. Let's do, a number of people are mentioning our school board does not permit us to make specific program recommendations, and that is typically the case. In a number of cases, it is not recommended, but we can talk about that as well. In terms of specific recommendations, I agree. And a lot of people are saying, well, we don't want to make specific recommendations. And that is correct. Yes and no, but we can talk about that. So let's talk about this. Let's take a look at where my cursor is. Let's take a look at the first recommendation here. So we have recommendation for participation in class, social interaction, mood and self-esteem, emotional regulation, increased vocabulary goal, and restroom accommodations. So clearly, this particular set of recommendations was taken from a neuropsychological report as pertinent to a child who, was having difficulty functioning, had limited vocabulary, was on the spectrum, and did have a number of significant difficulties. However, what is one very, significant problem with this? Well, this is sort of like self-explanatory. Participation in class is something that the child needs, whether or not your psychologist recommends it or not. Social interaction is part of a child's goal anyway. The same thing. So with mood and self-esteem, we certainly, so in other words, these recommendations do not add anything functional to the table. They don't tell us what to do with the child academically. They sort of state general observations. And that is a little bit of a difficulty because we don't know what to do with these recommendations. Let's move on to the top one. Let's move on to the one where it says ADHD. So here it says, given slow processing speed, ADHD, and reading disorder, it is recommended that the child is going to be provided with 50% extended time. It is also recommended that the child takes exam in an alternate setting that can minimize distractions. Okay, this is all lovely and this is all good, but I want to play devil's advocate. If you have a reading disability, and if you have difficulty reading, if you have specific problems, having 50% extended time in the classroom or taking an exam in an alternate setting is not going to fix your problem. If you place me in a physics class, and I never have taken physics, I have no idea, and you give me a test without absolutely no preparation, and I really don't know how to take this test, I could be there the entire day. I'm still going to earn a very, very poor grade because this is not helpful to me without somebody explicitly targeting my goals, whatever goals I have based on whatever deficits I have. Okay, let's look at the next one. The next one recommends participation in a structured social skills program because somebody needs appropriate social skills with peers. Again, it is a nice recommendation. There's only one problem. Well, what does that mean? What kind of social skills should be addressed? Should perspective-taking skills be addressed? Should social inferences be addressed? Should conflict resolution be addressed? Should irony and sarcasm be addressed? Should interpretations of facial expressions and body language be addressed? And that is the problem. General recommendations for something general will not produce the desired results. For example, a number of children on the spectrum are actually quite adept by now to, given whatever past treatments they may have had, they're actually quite good at determining facial expressions and body language, but they may have a difficulty in the area of perspective taking, as well as interpretation of ambiguous language, irony, and sarcasm. you don't want to place a child like that in a social communication group, which will be dealing with body language and facial expressions, because the child doesn't need those. The child needs something else. But without knowing where the deficits breakdown is, we can't really recommend any old random program because it's not helpful. Let's look at number 3, A, reading. Student will benefit from a balanced literacy approach. Well, the balanced literacy approach is not aligned with the science of reading. It is not a great recommendation to make. In the same breath, somebody is recommending an Orton-Gillingham program, coupled with a fluency model such as read naturally. Well, we have a problem here because we have kind of like this hodgepodge of recommendations, but I have no idea what is wrong with the students' reading abilities. I actually have no idea. What I am going to show you is something which is a little bit more functional as we move, towards the end of this presentation, because I want to show you what should be paid attention to when somebody is recommending anything. But based on this recommendation, I really don't know what is the child's difficulty in the area of reading. I don't know if this is a problem with phonemic awareness. I don't know if this is a problem with decoding. I don't know if this is an issue specifically with reading fluency, but maybe basic phonics abilities are intact. I don't know if this is an issue of orthographic mapping or orthographic knowledge. In other words, there's a lot of questions. All right, let's look at this recommendation. Here, somebody says a child has a reading disability, so they're either recommending Orton-Gillingham, Wilson, or Lindemood Bell. Well, those are 3 different programs. Those are 3 different programs with very different efficacy, with very different evidence base. And again, without knowing what the child's difficulties are, it's really pointless to make that recommendation, because guess what? I've seen that recommendation made for kids who absolutely did not need those programs. So for example, I have a client for whom Wilson was recommended. The problem was that Wilson is fantastic for phonics. Wilson is not terribly helpful, for example, for reading comprehension. And yet this client was actually an accurate but very, very slow reader. So the child was decoding disyllabic and multisyllabic words okay. Reading comprehension abilities were what was lacking. Wilson was not recommended for this child because it wouldn't be targeting what the issue is. So making blind recommendation without understanding where the deficits lie is a problem. All right, let's take a look at the last recommendation. Somebody has spelling and writing weaknesses. So teachers should help somebody proofread and edit writing. Well, I actually have a number of clients who work on spelling and writing weaknesses. And let me tell you something. If you are a terrible speller and a poor reader, proofreading doesn't really help much without me specifically addressing your specific weaknesses in the areas of spelling and writing. Proofreading only works if I'm actively targeting with you your areas of weaknesses. Proofreading and editing will not work if you have no idea what you're doing. If you don't know what your error patterns are, you're not going to be able to fix them. And that's a big problem. So this is just some examples. Let's take a look at some other recommendations. Okay. Let's take a look at something. This is a very unusual recommendation. The recommendation was that the child should be working on phonetics. Those of you who are speech language pathologists, can you please tell me what phonetics are? You can do it in the chat or you can do it in the question portion. Yes, That's what, so Beth actually put it for the panelists. So phonetics has to deals with the basic sounds of our language. When you take a phonetics class in grad school, it's usually your first semester in grad school, you just sit there and do transcription. You just sit there and somebody tells you, okay, you're transcribing in international phonetic alphabet symbols, how to transcribe the word, I don't know, butterfly or hippopotamus. But that's not what the child needs. So that is, phonetics is the study of speech sounds, or deals with studying of speech sounds of our language. So, oh, you know what, guys, somebody's saying they can't see Q&A. So if you're doing answers, please place all answers in chat, okay? So please place all answers in chat and do all panelists and attendees. Thank you. Somebody was actually very helpful. Okay. So no, this child doesn't need it. Now here is something interesting. This child, there was a recommendation for a Wilson reading program. There's only one tiny problem. This child was already getting Wilson, and he wasn't really being successful with Wilson because Wilson was not what the child needed. So recommendation for something like Wilson without truly understanding that child's difficulties, not helpful. All right, let's look at the next one. Child has exceptional skills in the oral language domain. Well, he needs to work orally or respond to oral examinations. Well, that's not really helpful if you're a poor reader. I mean, if you're a poor reader and if you're really a poor writer, and in this case, and you really need the ability to take written tests, and you really need the ability to read your instructions and then respond in writing. You're already going to be answering questions orally no matter what, because this is the only thing you have. But you need functional goals. You need functional goals to specifically address your area of difficulty. So the fact that somebody is giving you opportunity to respond orally is all fine and good, but it's not going to solve your problems of being a poor reader and writer. Only targeted remediation of your deficit areas will assist you with being a better reader and a better writer. All right, let's take a look at the last two recommendations. Whenever you see recommendations like this, I very strongly urge you, please, please, please proceed with a very, very significant caution. Now, please proceed with significant caution. Auditory processing disorder is quite a bit of a controversial diagnosis. It is not part of the DSM-5. It is part of the ICD-10 codes, but it has very, very debated validity as a standalone diagnosis. There is an excellent presentation done by an audiologist, Dr. Andrew Vermilio, which is posted on the Smart Speech Therapy videos portion of the site, which deals with the gold standard for auditory processing disorder. And one of the issues that we have is that whenever testing is done, testing cannot separate auditory processing successfully from language and cognition. And this is what makes it so difficult. So in other words, somebody is having difficulty clearly discriminating ending sounds in some words. That is a problem pertaining to language. It is a problem pertaining to speech sounds. It is a problem which is clearly related to something which is spoken. That has to do with phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. It has to do with reading, but it's not pure auditory system. So what typically happens when somebody who is a poor reader and a poor writer gets assessed for an auditory processing assessment, they usually end up diagnosed with auditory processing. The problem is they then get pretty much sent back to a speech language pathologist, and a speech language pathologist is expected to treat them. There are no special treatments for APD. All treatments for APD are language and literacy based. there are no programs which are effective for APD because these difficulties are indicative of language and literacy problems. So what happens is it's very easy to diagnose somebody with APD if they have language and literacy problems. But the end result is, what are you doing next? How is the child going to be supported functionally and treated functionally in the school system? Okay, before we move on to language assessments, I'll take a look at some comments and some questions. My goodness, there is a lot. So somebody mentioned something which I already specified, that what I just showed you are recommendations for accommodations and not goals, and that is correct. And we'll talk about that. That is absolutely correct. These are recommendations for accommodations and modifications. They're not accommodations for treatment goals. So let's do more. Now, someone is making comments that there are no recommendations often made for interventions and remediations for older students. Yes, if anybody wants to learn more about auditory processing and the controversy, I do have a series of posts, which are of course supported by evidence and journal articles. They're not just made up by me. On my website, smartspeechtherapy.com, if you click on auditory processing disorder controversy, you will be able to pull up quite a number of articles pertaining to questionable validity of the APD. Somebody actually said something which really is sad but sometimes true. The recommendations that I see are usually a cut and paste list, and that is correct. The recommendations I posted are not representative of one assessment. They're representative literally of hundreds of assessments, and they're very, very similar. They are a bit cut and paste. Okay. Somebody's asked me the name of the audiologist in the video on APD. It is Dr. Andrew Vermilio. Dr. Andrew Vermilio, he's very active in the SLPs for Evidence-Based Practice group. He can be easily tagged there and questions can be asked of him there. If anybody, I know some of the guys are really active. I can't post the gold standard for APD video link, but I know that I have a number of super helpful people who can do that. They can go to Smart Speech Therapy Facebook page, pull a copy of the link and post it in the chat option. And somebody just did that. And of course, Jamie just did that. So thank you so much. So yeah, if somebody is asking for something specific, and I mentioned that, somebody else who's familiar with my blog, with my website, they can go and pull that link for you. Stacy, this comment comes from Stacy. Some audiologists do treat as well as recommend expensive software to fix the problem. Yes, when that happens, please run away. The problem is that we have evidence that shows this is not functional treatments. These programs do not create functional outcomes for reading, writing, spelling, or oral language. You cannot treat to the test. You cannot give somebody a program which improves their dichotic listening abilities, and then, as a result, nothing generalizes to actual functional language. If you improved somebody's performance in a test, but that test is not indicative of real life performance, if you didn't improve oral language, social communication, reading, spelling, or writing, what is the purpose of that expensive and costly treatment, I ask you? I will be doing a presentation because a number of people asked me regarding the clinical validity of the APD diagnosis from a speech-language perspective. Dr. Vermilio handled it really well from an APD perspective, from an audiology perspective. I wanted to touch upon the SLP perspective, so I will be doing that in the future, so please stay tuned. Stay tuned. Okay. Let me quickly look at some. Okay, we can move on now to comprehensive language and literacy testing. All right, so again, hypothetically speaking, a good and sound assessment needs to do a couple of things. It needs to establish the extent to which the child's language weaknesses are impacting their academic performance. It can help determine appropriate educational environment. It should definitely establish present level of language and literacy functioning, strengths and needs. It absolutely must develop a comprehensive treatment goal hierarchy in order to improve social and academic functioning. So in the handouts, you can follow a number of links, and you can talk about how academic performance can be affected by a number of factors. If you have impaired intellect, intellectual abilities, your performance will be affected, obviously. If you have reduced working memory, it's going to make it difficult for you with respect to both oral language, reading and writing. If you have really slow processing abilities, you may be a really, really slow reader and decoder, and so on and so forth. But it's very important to understand the difficulties exhibited by children in school setting are language-based difficulties. That's really what they are. They're language-based difficulties, they are treatable difficulties. We can create comprehensive treatment plans based on assessment of areas of weaknesses. We can intervene successfully. We're not going to be intervening on things we have no control over. You cannot directly work on working memory. You cannot directly improve it. You cannot directly improve processing abilities. You cannot directly improve IQ. But you can improve these abilities by working on things which are improvable. Reading, writing, spelling, oral language, social communication, and so on and so forth. And as the student gets better at certain skills, you will see a very small, definitely small, no miracles there, jump in these abilities. You will see jump in points. You will see some improvement maybe in fluid reasoning. You will see a couple of points in memory. You will see a couple of points in processing. But you cannot work on these areas directly. It is simply not done. Here's the problem. Because not all language difficulties are very obvious. Many subtle language difficulties will not be readily recognized at all unless somebody does an appropriate assessment. And assessments definitely have to be targeted and they should be appropriate. You cannot just throw everything in a kitchen sink at a child and expect results. No, you have to look at the areas of difficulty only. Don't assess something which is a strength, it's irrelevant. So, this is, again, the standardized battery of assessments has to be targeted. We have to do clinical assessments. We have to look at their narratives. We have to look at their discourse. We have to look at their reading, writing, and spelling abilities. We have to, because many of these difficulties are not readily picked out by standardized testing. So we really need to rely on our training and on our education in order to actually determine things more in depth. Standardized testing, all standardized testing, even the best tests, have massive limitations. They were never meant to be this miracle testing. They were always meant to be looked at something valuable, important, but in need of supplementation. So there are issues with standardized testing. Some of them can have weak psychometric properties. We'll talk about that shortly. Some of them don't pick up well on higher order deficits, such as metalinguistic language. We need to supplement them by clinical assessments. And whoever is doing an assessments really needs to be very good at clinical analysis, and they need to be good at interpretation. All right. Okay, I'm just looking for some questions. Yes, the recording is actually available. It's a live stream. It's happening right now. Whatever video is live streaming, it's just going to remain on Facebook as a recording. All right. Somebody asked, is there a difference in terms of qualification to diagnose specific disorders between neuropsychs and school psychologicals? School neuropsychologists usually tend to do more extensive testing. School psychologists can do quite a bit of testing. They certainly do a really nice job with full-scale IQ testing. They also do a number of questionnaires and batteries pertaining to the child's psychiatric state, anxiety, ADHD, depression, and so on and so forth. Neuropsychs typically have a lot more time in their hands to do something far more comprehensive. Just to answer somebody else's question. Oops. Okay. Sort of went ahead a little bit. Okay. Here's an example of some relatively decent, but not without limitations, so don't quote me, please, SLP assessment batteries. So, okay. Again, listed in chronological order. And I wanted to list it in chronological order because I really didn't want to list it in the order of preference because I didn't want to get into hot water with that, and it's also not relevant. All of these tests have quite a bit of strengths. They're all useful in their own way. I use these and others in my clinical assessment batteries when I work with kids. I had actually 2 assessments today in the morning, so I use some of these. Some examples of these tests for illustration purposes. I'm so sorry, I don't mean it in chronological order. I meant that they're listed in alphabetical order. This is a mistake. I don't know why I decided to write chronological. I just meant alphabetical. You can clearly see they're listed in alphabetical order. I don't know why I decided to write chronological. It's a big mistake. So, some basic expectations. What should a good language and literacy report have? Well, it needs to talk about the student's difficulties in extensive detail. It needs to provide ICD-10 diagnosis, especially if this is a private report and parents are seeking reimbursement. Needs to have recommendations for accommodations and modifications. If the SLP did observations, they really need to talk about how the child did during an observation and whether things went well or didn't go so well. Depending on which area you are, what state you are in, what school district you're dealing with, and what is allowed legally in your state. A number of independent providers can make classroom recommendations. I've certainly done them in some reports I did for attorneys. I can suggest for certain evidence-based therapeutic approaches and additional services. They're mere suggestions. Nobody has to take my suggestions, but I can make them. And I can make suggestions for targeted goals and objectives. Literally, pretty much the only thing that is functional when it comes to long-term outcomes from my report are these goals and objectives. If I did a comprehensive 40-page report on a child and if I listed all of their difficulties, it's very important for me to provide specific recommendations of what should be done next with that child in terms of how the child should be treated. So, Guys, if you have any specific questions versus comments, put the questions in the Q&A. Some of you are writing very, very prolifically in chat, and given my time constraints, I may not be able to effectively read it as quickly. So specific questions, if you don't mind, please post them in Q&A. All right. So, an example of some findings. Again, this is just something that an SLP could find out. Now, these are in impression section. This is an impression section. It talks about the child's language and literacy weaknesses. The ratings are subjective. All ratings which say, below average, moderately impaired, severely impaired, they are all subjective. Even when you see these type of ratings in official tests, like test of let's say the CEL-5 or the CAPS or the GORD, they are subjective because it's really up to you in terms of interpreting it. Yes, these are points below the mean. Yes, this is a level of impairment as compared to the normative sample, but the labels are basically, they vary from test developer to test developer, and there's lots of different ways to label something. Typically, these examples would be highly familiar to speech-language pathologists. So speech-language pathologists reading this report, especially if they specialize in language and literacy, they ought to understand what it means, that the child cannot explain ambiguous and figurative language, and what does it mean if a 15-year-old child, for example, cannot engage in age-level discourse. They know what it means, they can't comprehend irony and sarcasm, and so on and so forth. This is, again, one of those suggested recommendations. If somebody is having difficulty in the area of writing, this could be a recommendation made by a speech-language pathologist, but this is a recommendation, it is suggested. This recommendation will accompany very specific writing goals. So in other words, somebody had already created writing goals based on the fact that the students' writing deficits, for example, are characterized by weaknesses in the area of spelling, logical sentence construction. So for example, their sentences are poorly made, are illogical, don't make sense, there is sense confusion, and so on and so forth. They have significant difficulty revising their sentences. They can't develop a persuasive composition appropriately, and that is supported in the report. And of course, as a result of all of these difficulties, they're not such a great proofreader and editor. So there will be goals to accompany that recommendation, but there's also some recommendations of some of the programs which could be used in order to work on those goals. So that can be done as well. Now, I gave you some examples of proceed with caution when it came from neuropsychological report recommendations. I want to talk about inappropriate speech-language batteries or inappropriate testing performed. So for example, the child came in because they have difficulty in the area of reading. The child came in because they had difficulty in the area of language. They had difficulty with more complex sentence comprehension. They had word finding ability. But the tests administered were not appropriate tests to look at the child's difficulties. If the child had issues in A, B, and C, why did the tests assess Y and Z? And that is a problem. Because if a child had difficulty with word finding, if a child had difficulty with complex sentence comprehension, if a child had difficulties with reading, then none of the above two tests actually address that. And if you look at the results, It says there are no further concerns, no further testing is warranted. That is not good. Somebody just did this testing for a child who is significantly struggling. But the problem is, because inappropriate testing was used, no functionality was attained from such an assessment. That is the problem. This is not helpful to the child in any setting. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about this battery. It's a highly familiar battery. I see this battery used by a variety of SLPs in a variety of states, and there is significant problem with this battery. These tests have certain limitations. Number one, they have not such great psychometric properties. Number two, test of vocabulary, the Peabody and expressive language. They're not useful for identification of anything. Just because you can point at a picture out of 4, or just because you can say a word, does not mean that you can functionally use those words in sentences, in discourse, in reading, and in writing. So vocabulary tests are absolutely unnecessary for any students who are basically over the age of 5, who are verbal, who can speak in complete sentences. We can use tests which ask children to manipulate vocabulary, and we will actually have much better results. Here is an example of one test which manipulates vocabulary. The test of integrated language and literacy has a vocabulary awareness subtest, which begins at 6 years of age. The child is given 3 words: dog, cat, bone. The child is asked, which 2 words go together? Why? Okay, what other 2 words go together and why? This is a much more functional task because it looks at the child's semantic flexibility skills. It looks at the child's ability to cognitively manipulate language and produce something meaningful and coherent out of that language. Let's take a look at some questions and comments. Bum, 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 bum. Okay. Multiple reviewers have written about some of the limitations of the SELF-5. The Leaders Project does an excellent job describing it. The SELF-5 test included a very large number of kids with language and learning needs in its normative sample, and we really need to avoid that. So I just wanted to comment on that because it's something which came in the chat option. I don't have the time or the opportunity to talk about the literacy gap. This is not that sort of a presentation, so unfortunately I cannot address that. The webinar is going to be posted on my both blog and Facebook page. You can watch it there. You can rewatch it to your heart's consent. I'm not removing it. This is for informational purposes. Somebody asked, what did I recommend instead of vocabulary tests? I recommend any tests which are used for the purposes of semantic flexibility. And I mentioned vocabulary awareness, subtest of the TILS. Somebody asked me what I think about the test of word finding. Test of word finding is lovely. Unfortunately, even kids with massive word finding difficulties actually have difficulties at the level of discourse. Test of vocabulary, test of word finding will not locate difficulties at the area of discourse. It only locates difficulties at the area, at the level of words. So if you want to catch somebody's word-finding difficulties, I highly recommend discourse-based assessments or narrative assessments. They're far more reliable and they provide a wealth of information. The issues with FSEL-5 can be found in either the Leaders Project website. They can also be found all over the SLPs for Evidence-Based Practice group. Lots of information there. They can also be found on my blog. I've written about them before. Let's look at a couple of more questions. Somebody asked me, how would I accommodate students with working memory difficulties with a semantic flexibilities test? I will not accommodate them. I want to reveal their difficulties. They're getting no accommodations from me during testing. I'll accommodate them during treatment. But during testing, I want to know the extent of their difficulties. Otherwise, what's the point? My treatment is not going to be reliable if I'm providing testing accommodations. Can SLPs diagnose dyslexia using the tools? Yes, I believe so. I really hate using the word dyslexia because it's so misused and misunderstood. SLPs can certainly diagnose reading, writing, and spelling disabilities using the tools in conjunction with additional testing. This is not the presentation which necessarily addresses bilingual children. However, a number of these tests can be used with simultaneously bilingual kids. Very important to understand that at a certain point, if somebody had received good quality instruction, issues should be going away. But if somebody continues to struggle, one has to be very careful not to accidentally deny bilingual students with literacy deficit services. So, but that's a completely different type of a presentation. So, please continue placing all questions in the chat option. I really thought I would be a little faster than this, but what can I do? There's a lot of information and tons of questions. So it looks like we'll be here for longer than an hour. If you're willing to tolerate that, so am I. So let's talk about test overlaps. When we have two professionals doing the assessment, let's say a neuropsychologist and speech pathologist in terms of comprehensive language and literacy, they each will provide a courtesy list to each other. They really don't want to repeat the same tests. So you want to avoid the practice effect. The practice effect is essentially when a child takes the same test in a short period of time, and as a result of taking that test the second time, actually does better, but that improvement is not due to anything other than the test was taken twice and the child actually learned something in the process of taking that test. So you make some basic substitutions. If somebody is using the phonological awareness test, you can use the CTOP instead. Somebody used the GORD, you can substitute it for the TORC. You can also use different forms of tests. Tests such as GORD and SAL have forms A and B. You can swap one form for the other form and do that if it is necessary for these tests to be repeated. I generally do not do that. I try not to repeat tests. So if a neuropsychologist is doing something, I will not, use the same test. Okay. Schools have a capacity to use both types of assessment results in a particular way. So they will provide the students with, relevant educational classifications. So somebody can get a learning disability classification. They can give the students an IEP or a 504 plan. They can determine classroom placement. They can establish accommodations and modifications to be included in an IEP or 504 plan. Now, we have a problem because a lot of times, and those people who do comprehensive language and literacy assessments will blow up the chat option right now, and they're going to tell you that there's huge discrepancies. Sometimes you're in an IEP meeting, You are reviewing the results of educational tests. You're reviewing the results of achievement tests, such as the Wyatt, the Woodcock-Johnson, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, these kids are coming up smelling of roses on those assessments, but they are not on my comprehensive language and literacy assessments. What is the difference? The issue is that a number of educational tests were developed to rank children within the range of the general population. So we know that because their technical manuals do not have information on discriminant accuracy or sensitivity and specificity. So these students will just do great on those tests, but have serious impairments. So here's what we need. We need to have information on discriminant accuracy in the manual. We need to know that assessment can accurately identify students who are language impaired, as truly language impaired. We need to know that those students who are not language impaired will not accidentally be identified with a disability as a result of that. That information will be found in the manual if that information exists. Now, criteria for this type of discriminant accuracy is considered to be 90 or above is great. 80 to 89 is fine. You'll survive. It's going to be fairly accurate or fair. Below 80%, we actually have a lot of misidentification and a really high rate, which leads to serious social consequences of misidentified children. So that's a problem. So what is the most important information we need to know about standardized assessments? Well, if a discriminant accuracy section is missing from the manual, tests should not be used for the purpose of disorder identification because its results will not be accurate. Okay, here's an example I used in another presentation on the psychometric properties of reading assessments. So this is an example from the Wyatt as compared to TILS. When we look at how high the child scored on the Wyatt in the areas of word reading, decoding, reading fluency, and spelling, the child is really smelling of roses. But let's look at the actual percent of, let's look at the actual percent of, how the child did on the TILS. We will actually see far poorer scores. Why such significant difference? Well, the TILS did not include any children with language and learning disabilities in its normative sample. And we don't know what is the sensitivity and specificity of the Wyatt because that information is not included in their technical manual. Oops. So, this is an important issue. So far, I have not encountered any neuropsychological reports which made specific treatment goal recommendations. I have not seen them. If somebody has seen them, please do share that information. That information is important. There is also another problem. There are no professionals in the school setting to follow and implement these goals. Even if neuropsychologists made specific treatment recommendations, they cannot be executed in the school setting. There are no neuropsychologists or psychologists who treat language and literacy difficulties in the schools. Speech-language pathologists can and many do treat literacy in the schools, especially now that the tides are changing and many speech-language pathologists are starting to specialize in language and literacy. But there is a catch. I cannot implement somebody else's treatment recommendations without my own comprehensive assessment. I can't. In the ASHA, it's not in the ASHA Code of Ethics. In my scope of practice, I have to do my own assessment. I can't really follow somebody else's assessment. I have to do my own. So I still have to do my own assessment no matter what. Interestingly, if I make recommendations for these type of, if I make recommendations for language and literacy goals, actually, reading specialists can take my recommendations for phonemic awareness or reading fluency and comprehension, and they can actually implement it in the school system due to some of the compatibility. In fact, in my setting where I am, because I don't just have a private practice, I also work in a specialized school. I routinely shared kind of the responsibilities with our reading specialist, and we basically complemented each other and supplemented what each of us did and worked on similar goals together. Now, we talked about recommendations for social skills instruction. Here's what goals actually look like as a result of somebody's assessment. The child was assessed with clinical assessment of pragmatics. As a result of what had occurred and what his scores were on the test, and as a result of difficulties on that test, these were the goals which were made to address the student's areas of need. They were made specifically because of how the child did during observation and during testing. So as you can see, they're specific, they're targeted, and if somebody addresses them, the child's pragmatic abilities will get better. Now, these are short-term goals. These are not session goals. Short-term goals typically take a few months to address, and they could be addressed in cycles. But these are not session goals. They're simply goals for which the speech-language pathologist will need to make specific, more targeted session goals and work on them. But this is not a recommendation for non-specific social skills program. This is a recommendation based on what somebody's areas of difficulties are. Similarly, this is a child with poor reading abilities. I'm not recommending Wilson. I'm not recommending Orton Gillingham. But what I am recommending is we're gonna need to map some vowel combinations. We're gonna need to map some trigraphs because child cannot do that. We're gonna need to map some consonants, clusters, and blends. This is what I uncovered in the process of my assessment. This is what the child needs because these were the difficulties due to which the child was not a great reader. This is a child who doesn't need phonics. This is a slow but accurate reader, great decoder, super high score on a non-word reading subtest of the TILS, or the test of integrated language and literacy. I have a problem. This child has really, really poor reading comprehension. So the child needs some reading comprehension goals. I actually make more specific recommendations on how to address each of these goals in my reports, but this is an example of some basic reading comprehension goals. If these are addressed, the child's reading comprehension will get better. So, what is the major differences summary? Neuropsychologists make more general recommendations to assist students with functioning in academic setting. Good quality speech-language reports make specific executable treatment goals which can be implemented in a school setting by fellow speech-language pathologists in order to actively intervene and improve abilities in affected areas of functioning. Neuropsychologists may recommend a particular program to address reading, Orton Gillingham, Wilson, etc. Speech-language pathologists need to create specific goals for reading, but actually say these are the limitations of specific program. So, the child has excellent decoding but very poor comprehension. You can't use the Wilson program because at this time, the Wilson program does not have efficacy for that particular skill. It hasn't been found to be effective for that. So, some of the role differences continue. We can create a deeper analysis and have greater comprehension of language-based literacy deficits. Neuropsychologists may recommend an application of a particular writing approach to a child with, let's say, difficulty in the area of writing. Speech-language pathologists may recognize that particular program is way too advanced for the child's present level of writing abilities based on a targeted writing assessment and analysis of their writing difficulties. So they may adjust expectations and create a more targeted and hierarchical goals, which are better suitable for the child's present writing needs. So, what questions should parents ask when they're working on selecting what type of assessments they need? This is a very brief list, but this is a list of some hard-hitting areas. Here's what some of the basic things they need to know. What tests are you using and why did you select these specific tests? Do these tests contain information on discriminant accuracy in the manuals? So, can a test be used for the purpose of differentiating learning disabled kids from typically developing students? What happens if the test will show that the student performed in the average range, but the student is struggling significantly in school? Kids who are designated as twice exceptional, kids with very high IQ. This is what happens to them routinely on educational tests. They can go through very, very extensive neuropsychological batteries. They can come up smelling of roses. It's very difficult to create goals for them because you don't know what to do. You take the same child for comprehensive language and literacy testing, and boy, do the deficits just start pouring out. So it's very important then, what's the contingency plan? Because guess what? If a test is showing that the child is having average abilities, but the parents and teachers clearly see that the child is struggling, somebody better explain that discrepancy and somebody better understand, well, what do I do to help this child? Because if there is no functional treatment goals and treatment plan for this child, that child will simply continue to flounder. That child will simply continue to do poorly. That's not functional. We're missing functionality. We have to do better. Now, will the assessment result in the student receiving targeted therapies in school setting? Or will it only result in recommendations for accommodations, modifications, and educational classification? If assessment will not result in targeted treatment goals, you have a problem. It is not functional. It means more time will be wasted until somebody does a reassessment and until somebody creates some sort of a functional treatment plan. Accommodations modifications do not work for language deficits. The best way I can put it is like this. I don't speak French. You place me in a French class. You can place me in front of the teacher, very close. The teacher could give me an FM system. The teacher could be yelling at my ears very loudly. The teacher could be right in front of me. I could be given 50% extended time. None of that is going to help me be better at French. Because guess what? Somebody better teach me French. Because I have no idea what's happening. Same thing. If you don't know how to manipulate language, if you don't know how to read, if you don't know how to write, if you don't know how to spell, no amount of accommodations and modifications is going to help you until somebody fixes your problem. It's as simple as that. Now, we're getting down to the whole point of this. Will the assessor formulate goals and objectives for treatment purposes or recommend additional testing with other assessors? That is, again, a very, very big determination. Are we going to be hunting for tests? Are we going to be just putting the child through this very, very extensive testing process and nothing will come as a result of it? That is a problem, because there is such a thing as a testing effect, and that poor child will be absolutely exhausted. He or she will absolutely hate the process, and when a legitimate evaluation comes around, that child may be done. They don't want to deal with any more assessments. Very important not to traumatize kids with these assessments, because these assessments, they are extensive. They're really, really affect the kids' confidence and motivation and their self-efficacy, and they really need to be done once or twice, but they need to be done well, because these kids are traumatized by these assessments. And I've certainly experienced that more than once when I'm dealing with kids who are illiterate in 5th grade or 6th grade. It is tragic, it is heartbreaking, and it's absolutely not acceptable because it is not functional. So, what is functional? Well, functionality is everything. Functional assessments are psychometrically sound. They're tests which are sensitive to the diagnosis of disorders and disabilities. They're absolutely crucial for these really, really smart and savvy kids with isolated areas of difficulty, especially kids whose IQ is through the roof, 128, 130, 132. Functional assessments should have both standardized and clinical examples. They really should have examples of grade level reading and writing. They need to be done by students independently. They need to contain appropriate interpretation of deficit areas, and they have to contain goals and objectives for treatment purposes. All right, you guys, I am now out of time, so I am now going to take your questions, comments, and concerns in both chat and Q&A. It's been an absolute pleasure, so keep the questions coming. I'm not terribly overboard, just 14 minutes over. I'll try to address everything in a timely manner as much as I can. This is my information. I believe it's been posted in the chat option. I am very, very easy to reach. I'm pretty much around, so if you need me, this is the way to contact me. Now let's take a look at some of the questions. I'll go through the Q&A first. A question comes from Beth. How do we find somebody who can do this type of in-depth assessment in our area? Really depends on people's qualifications. I do not know. If you have specific questions regarding this, you can reach out to me privately, but otherwise, you know, you really have to look at people's qualifications very carefully. Unfortunately, because of a lack of time, I don't have recommendations for bilingual students in testing. That's a talk for another presentation. I do lots of those, so I'm just gonna save it for next time and talk explicitly regarding bilingual kids. I really only budgeted an hour on this, so unfortunately, I'll only take the questions very relevant to the immediate topic. What do you do if you're in a private school and the district did expressive vocabulary test on a child over 5? Well, that's a kind of a loaded question. I don't know what to do. That would depend on a whole bunch of things. I would do a clinical reassessment in the context of therapy sessions if standardized assessments are not available to me or I'm not allowed to do them. What is the most efficient language and literacy assessment in a busy school system? My recommendation for efficiency's sake for kids 6 and over, if you can, test of integrated language and literacy, clinical assessment of pragmatics, and an absolute must, discourse analysis or narrative analysis. No language samples. Language samples are not useful. Narrative samples and discourse samples are far more sensitive to the identification of a whole lot of problems. How can parents find SLPs specializing in literacy? Great question. Search online, search for their qualifications, look for their CV. Nowadays, every speech pathologist with a private practice has a website. So you can just Google, I don't know, language and literacy SLP in Georgia. You'll find something like that. But the vast majority of people do share their qualifications online. Yes, this presentation is posted in multiple places. Let's see what else. If no functional assessment was done by an evaluator, I highly recommend you do your own functional assessment in the context of therapy sessions. For students with cognitive deficits as well as language and literacy impairments, would you recommend collaborative assessment with SLP Neuro or individual assessments in each? Usually both SLPs and Neuros tend to function separately, so they're going to end up doing individual assessments in each. I don't know any Neuros who function together with SLPs. That is not to say that they don't. What are my thoughts on SALT analysis? It's great if you have it. That's my thoughts, but I recommend supplemented things. SALT analysis is fantastic, but I recommend supplementation. What else we got? Oh, somebody said, my favorite, the bane of my existence, recommendation for students will follow directions. No, so it is possible to make goals based on subtest performance. For example, the clinical assessment of pragmatics has the subtest on irony and sarcasm. That is a very, very functional goal. You absolutely should have a goal for interpretation of irony and sarcasm. But for example, students will recall sentences and students will follow directions are absolutely non-functional goals. They're absolutely terrible goals, which will never result in any generalization for the students. So unfortunately, they cannot be used effectively. Let's take a look at the thoughts in a castle for supralinguistics and semantic flexibility. I don't use the castle. I don't use the castle because of some of my concerns regarding psychometric properties of the castle. So for suprasegmentals, I use the CAPS because CAPS has great suprasegmental subtests, actually a few of them, and they're far more and they're really good. If you can find an SLP in literacy in your area, consider reaching out to SLPs in some other areas. You can consider some telepractice assessments. It may be doable, and that would be a recommendation. So there's, especially in a time of COVID, there is some guidance from ASHA regarding some of the more relaxed teletherapy applications, so that can be done online, provided everything is aligned. The test for irony and sarcasm assessment, it's part of a clinical assessment of pragmatics. Is there a test that can be used by school district team to evaluate spoken language functions in noisy environments? Excellent question. I do not know. I do not believe so. I could be wrong, but typically if a student does really poorly in a quiet test setting, they're certainly not going to do better in a noisy setting. But portions of the TAPS do use the noise function. But TAPS, again, I have some concerns regarding its psychometric properties. But the TAPS, TAPS-4, does have a subtest which assesses speech in noise recognition. But again, some limitations there. All right, I finished with the Q&A, and let me look at the blown up chat option. Okay, let me see where we're going with the chat here. Bum, 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 bum. All right. My best recommendation to evaluate discourse in terms of word finding, I recommend the peer conflict resolution tasks for children 11 and a half and older, and I recommend fictional narrative assessments for children, between preschool and approximately 4th grade. Some of the recommendations are actually on my website as well, and they provide details. What do you recommend when a school psychologist recommends an audiologist evaluation for auditory processing? I go speak to the school psychologist, I express my concerns, I outline the evidence, I explain the outcomes, and keep my fingers crossed and hope for the best. What tests do I like to assess reading comprehension? Well, I do like the GORT and the TORC-4. I mentioned that in the presentation. Nothing works better than an actual clinical assessment. I get a grade level passage. I ask the student to read it from start to finish. One caveat, it has to be only 1 page long. And then I start asking the student questions pertaining to main idea, summarization, complex vocabulary words based on a metalinguistic and metacognitive vocabulary, and so on and so forth. Let's see what else. I think the rest is just people who are happy with my presentation. And I don't see any other questions. questions? Is it time to say goodbye? Could it be? Yes. Oh, somebody asked, how long does it take to do these test assessments? I can tell you my average typically takes approximately 6 sessions between 1 hour and 15 minutes and 1 hour and 30 minutes long. That's how much, that's what it typically takes for me when I do these comprehensive assessments. You can certainly do less. In a school system, obviously I don't do such comprehensive assessments in the school system. I mentioned my battery, the TILs, the CAPS, and the clinical sample, fairly quick turnaround. I can be very fast. But then those kids I have are long-term because they're my clients. So I can keep reassessing them based on need. So I have a lot more flexibility versus for comprehensive purposes, I get a one-shot deal with a student and then I'll never see them again. All right, that's it. Looks like we are, oh, is there more questions? Any specific recommendations for assessing high school students with writing difficulties? Yes, there is a post on my blog discussing clinical writing assessments and how to perform them. It could be under, I believe it's under on the right-hand side. There is a kind of like a bunch of subheadings that it says clinical assessments. And if you keep scrolling for those posts, you'll find the clinical writing assessments. Let's see. And how to follow me for more workshops. Oh, okay. Well, I announced everything in the SLPs for Evidence-Based Practice group. So pretty much, and also on my Smart Speech Facebook website, I basically do these type of EPP real talks very randomly whenever I have a modicum of time. So there is really no rhyme or reason when they're scheduled. For lack of better words, I do them when I'm bored. Because right now I can't really travel in the time of COVID. So if I have a little bit of free time, I don't mind, sharing a little information. The tests I recommend for high school students experiencing writing difficulties, you can start with the TOWEL 4, but the TOWEL 4, the test of writing has limitations. It's very basic. It basically screens you for basic literacy and not much else. So I definitely recommend persuasive writing composition. I have recommendations on how to do a persuasive writing sample on my website. So, and looks like we're done. Well, you guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. You know how to find me, and if there is no further questions, I will say goodbye for today. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a blast. I will see everybody around. Thank you, and have a wonderful new year, wonderful holidays, much better next year versus this year. This year has been rough on so many of us, so hoping that everybody will be in much better spirits next year. Wishing everybody all the best. I will announce the next presentation whenever it's going to be available, whenever I will think of something. And that's it. See you online. Take care.